Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, have you heard of so-called ghost signs? You've no doubt walked or driven by them, faded business advertisements painted onto old buildings. There are efforts in Connecticut to preserve these ghost signs. Some date back to the late 1800s. We'll talk to a Cheshire company involved in helping to restore ghost signs in Old Saybrook. The John Canning Company focuses on conservation and restoration, taking on projects in Connecticut and around the globe. We'll hear from the founder and a principal of the company. That's later. First, the spooky season is behind us now, but Connecticut has many historic houses with stories about sightings or encounters that happen year-round. Joining us now on Zoom is Grace Belanger, Mark Twain House Associate Director of Interpretation. Grace, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you so much for having us.
And Mallory Howard is here, who's an assistant curator at the Mark Twain House. Mallory, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So, Grace, tell us about how long you've been at the Mark Twain House. And was there a time where there might have been a strange encounter that employees shared among themselves, but there wasn't a decision to really make those encounters public?
Yes, well, I've been here at the Mark Twain House since 2006. And, when I first started working here, I was just working as a historic interpreter, basically a guide giving tours. And some of those some of my colleagues who had been here longer often spoke about things sort of in hushed whispers, but it wasn't really talked about outright other than in the break room. Until about 2009. But, we were always told by the old hands at interpretation that you should be aware that you might smell cigar smoke or hear things or, experience things that maybe weren't within the realm of reality, I guess is the best way of describing it. And then all that changed about 2009.
So before we get to why it changed in 2009, when you heard this from other staff, were you someone who was maybe thought this wasn't really the case? Or when you first noticed something strange, what was your reaction?
I think the first thing I noticed was definite smell of cigar smoke at weird times, maybe when I was alone in the house, and it was disconcerting to say the least. But I have a sort of open mind about things, I guess, and wasn't spooked by it, but it was definitely disconcerting.
And the cigar smoke, Samuel Clemens smoked a lot of cigars?
Smoked up, anywhere from 24 to 40 cigars a day, we've been told. He would buy them by the barrel. And they weren't the good Cuban cigars. They were cheap Connecticut cigars, rolled in South Windsor or someplace like that. So
he kept it local.
Yeah, he did.
And so you said everything changed in 2009. So tell us about that, Grace.
At the time, we had Jacques Lamar was our communications director, and a woman reached out to him with a photograph that she had taken of the home, which is a little bit unique in the fact that when you look at it from one angle, you really can't see anything. But when you look at it, you blow it up and you look at it up close, it appears that there are two figures standing in the window looking out. And one of those figures was a child and the other was a woman. And they both appear to be dressed in sort of old-fashioned garb. And Jacques latched onto that, and we started talking about experiences that people had in the house, and we had some investigations done by those that seek out the paranormal. One investigative group was the Smoking Gun Research Agency. I guess they're based in southern Connecticut. And then after that investigation, the Atlantic Paranormal Society the group that was featured on the show Ghost Hunters on the Sci-Fi Channel came and investigated. And all the stories that staff and guests had been telling sort of behind the scenes for many years sort of are brought to life. And we are now in 2009 talking about them amongst ourselves. And we all kind of realized that we'd all experienced something, but hadn't really talked about it, other than the cigar smoke, which was just legend. Many of us had some sort of experience that we couldn't explain. And once we were talking about it, some of those experiences meshed up. Mallory had a great experience and others had experienced it as well. So
you're hearing Grace Belanger here from the Mark Twain House, an Associate Director of Interpretation, as we talk about the Mark Twain House and some encounters that has led the historic home to give specific tours based on some of these experiences. You can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Mallory Howard is here, Assistant Curator at the Mark Twain House. So you were in that episode of Ghost Hunters. What did you share?
I shared a particularly at the time jarring experience. I was giving a tour and I was in the drawing room of the house, and over the fireplace is a giant plate glass window which allows you to see into the front hall where you first enter. And I was talking about their oldest daughter, Susie, who unfortunately passed away in the house. And as I was talking about her, I saw what appeared to be a head pass by that window in the front hall. And I thought, well, I have to keep an eye on them, make sure it's not a visitor who wandered away, that it's a colleague who's allowed to be here. And I saw the movement continue past a door that was slightly ajar and into the dining room, which was to my right. And I turned to confront the person, and I saw a full-bodied apparition of a woman. Even the movement of her dress, her hair upkept, and it just, I had a physical reaction. I stopped talking, my heart started pounding, I started shaking, to the point where a visitor had to come up and ask if I was all right. And of course, I didn't want to admit that I had possibly just seen a ghost. So I just said I had frozen up for a minute, and I continued on with the tour. And afterwards, I really thought about it and couldn't believe what I had seen.
And you came back to work the next day?
I did, surprisingly, yes.
Again, when we think about how there was a shift among staff before you would share these stories, but it wasn't something that you really mentioned to the public. And so now I believe the Mark Twain House has been holding graveyard shift ghost tours, and not necessarily pegged always to Halloween. Can you talk about why there was that shift and how the public has responded?
Yes, I think as Grace mentioned, once Jacques came on board, we started having more open discussions about what people had experienced or seen in the house. I had realized that the woman, the apparition I had seen, other colleagues had also seen her throughout the house. So it was decided this is an aspect of our history and experiences at the museum that we really should be sharing with others. And that's how the graveyard shift tours were born. And I think it's been really great for us. Not all museums want to do them. Not all museums agree that they should be done. But we decided that it was something we were interested in and we wanted to share with the public. And it has been wonderful. We have many people that come to visit us for the ghost tours, and they will come back and do a daytime tour because they're so intrigued, and we hook them at the ghost tours, and they want to come back and learn more about the house, more about Mark Twain and his family. And it opened us up to a whole new audience of people who are now lifelong fans of the house and Mark Twain. So it's really gone great for us. And I think the public appreciates learning the history of spiritualism and talking more about what happened in Nook Farm and seances and the tragedy that the Clemens family had to go through. It's a whole different aspect of the family's history and the house's history. So we are still diving in to a lot of that, but also sharing experiences. So it is fun because you get to hear spooky stories and things that have happened, but it also is teaching you about a whole other aspect of Twain.
So talk more, Mallory, about spiritualism and the time that Mark Twain lived in the home and the family's beliefs.
Yeah, so spiritualism really took off in the U.S. in the 1840s with Maggie and Kate Fox of Rochester, New York. They were known for their spirit rappings, and they were very popular, and they toured across the country. It was later determined, they sort of recanted that they could talk to spirits because they were able to train themselves to crack their toes and their knuckles to make it sound like spirit rappings. But it sort of popularized it at the time. And it also takes off again in the 1860s with the Civil War. Over 600,000 people die. Families are desperate to connect with their loved ones they never had a chance to say goodbye to or put to rest. And so that's when it really takes off again. And the Clemenses move into Nook Farm, which is the neighborhood here in Hartford. They move into their house in 1874. And one of their neighbors, Isabella Beecher Hooker, who was the half-sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, was a well-known spiritualist, and she had mediums over her house quite often for seances. She was even told in 1876 at the stroke of midnight that she would become ruler of the world. So she had a party to celebrate. We know the Clemenses attended. Unfortunately, she did not become ruler of the world, I'm sure much to her dismay. But Clemens attended parties like that. He dabbled in writing articles about seances when he worked for a newspaper in San Francisco. He was supposed to debunk seances and show the mediums that were deemed to be frauds. So he had a long history with it. And unfortunately, he also faced a lot of tragedy. He lost 3 of his 4 children, a younger brother due to a steamboat explosion. So throughout his entire life, he's really going back and forth about wanting to believe. Can he believe? He wants to connect with the loved ones he lost, but is it something that is real? So it's very interesting to see how he evolves throughout his lifetime about whether spiritualism is something he can really believe in or not.
Grace, can you talk more about when someone goes on this specific tour, like how you're talking about spiritualism and Mark Twain's background? And again, I'm curious how the public responds. Do we have a lot of fans who already know this part of his life, or this is the first time they're hearing about it?
I think it's probably, 75% of them come because it's a ghost tour, and 25% come because they understand Twain's background. I find that's what the makeup of our visitors for the graveyard shift tours are. They leave knowing a little more about spiritualism, Twain's involvement in the movement, his belief and disbelief in the movement. And many of our visitors are very interested in learning how Jason and Grant and their team from the Atlantic Paranormal Society, as featured on Ghost Hunters on Sci-Fi Channel, are investigating the house. They have a following, and that following comes to us. We talk about Twain's involvement in spiritualism. We also talk about his own belief in what he called the powers of the mind while we're on tour. And then we will interject tales of the experiences people have had through the house. And, many of the guests actually have their own experiences during these tours. And we encourage people to share them and explain those experiences in a letter or something like that, so we can continue to compile the stories that are told about the hauntings in the house and such. There have been some interesting stories that have come out, and we've turned non-believers into believers. I had a great story of a gentleman who came with his family. They loved the Ghost Hunters show, and they were going to all the sites that the Ghost Hunters had investigated. And he was a non-believer, until he came here. Something happened to him, and he now believes. Talk to him at least once a year, and he asks me about the ghosts in the house. So,
Mallory Howard, again, you're also with us, assistant curator of the Mark Twain House. So these tours have been wildly popular. So talk more about, how they fit into, your overall aims at the Twain House to inform people about Samuel Clemens, but also the historic period and Hartford, what it was like in the late 1800s.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an avenue that we like to go more in depth about. People will come during one of our daytime tours, whether it's a regular tour or a living history tour, and they learn about Hartford at the time and Nook Farm, the neighborhood that the Clemenses lived in, and what it was like for their children growing up with Mark Twain as their dad and the stories that they got to hear. And it's a lot of fun to do those. But there's a whole other side that people want to learn about. And it just gives us another opportunity to share more knowledge that we have about a completely different aspect. So we're sharing information that you don't get any other time except for those tours. And we can dive a little bit deeper into Isabella Beecher Hooker and how the women's suffrage movement connects to spiritualism. And we can talk a little bit more about those tragedies and explore Twain's mindset during them. And there's also the bonus of just being able to see the house in a completely different light, both literally and figuratively. You get a little bit of a different aspect walking through. And so I think it's really helped us gain a new audience, gain a new appreciation from people about how many different aspects of history they can explore at our site.
Mallory Howard, again, is the assistant curator at the Mark Twain House. Grace Belanger was also here, Mark Twain House associate director of interpretation. Grace and Mallory, it's such a pleasure to hear this side of the history at the Twain House. And I know many of our listeners are looking forward to hopefully some holiday events coming up. Grace?
We are going to be decorated for the holidays on or about Thanksgiving, Mallory?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Christmas tours to the general public will start the day after Thanksgiving. If you want to come visit us on Thanksgiving weekend, make sure you make your reservations now because we are extremely busy that weekend. And then we are not going to have in-person holiday events, but we do have a virtual series. Our Clemens Conversation virtual series is going to be exploring over the course of 4 weeks, one night a week, various aspects of Clemens Christmases. So we've got Charity in the Gilded Age, we've got decorating the home. Their travels abroad during the Christmas holiday seasons is another subject matter. And then just, what a family Christmas would be like here in Hartford. And we have a number of great upcoming talks, both in person and virtual, that you can learn about on our website, www.marktwainhouse.org. It's going to be a busy few months, and we're hoping that you'll all join us.
It's a wonderful treasure to have here in our state. Grace and Mallory, thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
You've been listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we talk to a local company that specializes in historic restoration and preservation. The John Canning Company has done work at the Twain House, among many others. And later, do you know about ghost signs? There are efforts in Old Saybrook to uncover and preserve more of them. Stay with us. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We just heard from the Mark Twain House in Hartford. The late 19th century home is a National Historic Landmark built in the Victorian Gothic Revival style. My next guest helped restore the Twain House's guest quarters, known as the Mahogany Suite. Joining us now on Zoom is John Canning, founder and a principal at John Canning and Company, based in Cheshire. John, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Lucy, and thank you for having us on your show.
Also with us, David Riccio, who's also a principal at John Canning and Company. David, thanks for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
And if you enjoy historic preservation efforts in our state and want to learn more, you can join us as well. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter @WhereWeLive. So, John, I'll start with you. I mentioned earlier that your company does work in Connecticut, but also around the globe. Let's start first with the Mark Twain House and Museum. What was your first visit to this house like? Can you describe your impressions of it?
Yes. Well, the restoration of the Mark Twain House, of course, has been going on since about the 1960s. My first impression of the historic house was when I first emigrated to the United States from Scotland, about 1969. I visited the house because the restoration was ongoing, and were very interested in what quality of work was being done. And I actually befriended a couple of the decorators that were doing the work. That's the Sands brothers from Hartford. I was very impressed by the quality of their work and also the research that went into reconstructing the original Tiffany Comfort's United Artists Studios decoration. And so that was my first impression, being so impressed by the skill and the work that was being carried out then.
Did you think one day that you would be doing work in that home as well?
I had two thoughts about that. One, yes, I would love to do work in there, which we eventually ended up doing. However, I thought that because the Sands brothers had done so much good work there, it would only be right that if they done future restorations. But of course, both of them are retired now, and we did get the invitation to do the recent restoration of the house, the guest suite in particular.
It's just beautiful inside the Twain house. You think about the detailed woodwork, the stenciling, even the outside, the painted bricks, all of the gables. And so I mentioned the mahogany suite. So tell us about this project. What made it so unique?
Okay, well, the guest suite, which we restored, which became known as the mahogany room, that was because of its rich and durous mahogany furnishings and woodwork. I should add that during this restoration, the John Canning Company was pleased to be a part of the restoration team, which consisted of Don's construction and was led by the project architect, David Scott Parker, who was responsible for most of the research, architectural research in the room. So again, our role in that team was to implement the restoration work in the traditional methods and practices of the Victorian period. This included the plaster consolidation and repairs of the ceiling and walls, refinishing of all of the woodwork, polychroming, gilding, and the installation of Candace Wheeler's award-winning wallpaper design, Honeybee, which was reproduced on canvas for the ceiling and the walls. And Candace Wheeler arguably was the first lady interior designer and graphic designer.
May I add that, John, the description of the honeybee, the honeycombs and the pattern, and of course the pattern on the ceiling, which maybe apropos to our conversation today, had spider webs as well. So very interesting and complex pattern design.
So you're hearing David Riccio, who's also a principal at John Canning and Company. David, I had described the company as a restoration and conservation company, but when you think about also when you go into a place like the Twain House, like also the amount of decoration. And so how do you get into this line of work? I think of you and John as maybe artists and historians.
Yes, I would say that applies. Craft first. John and I came into this industry in different paths, and I think John's path is quite interesting, which he can elaborate on. But I followed in his footsteps, and I came into the field post college with a business background, focusing on business management, and I am married to John's youngest daughter. And so I've known John before I entered this industry and this practice. And we were working together on a business level and communicating, talking about business development and management and business reach and things of that nature. And through that relationship, and of course, that personal relationship, we started connecting on the idea of preservation and me coming on board. And John mentored me through a very strict 5-year apprenticeship program in the decorative paint and plastering craft. And this apprenticeship is an old world apprenticeship where the master painter really works closely, both in practical sense, but also in an educational sense, as John did with me. There's many conversations, many discussions about old world techniques and materials that he has practiced and instilled upon me. And to this day, I can walk into a building and look at a treatment that I may have never actually seen before or touched or restored. But because of that apprenticeship and that, in some ways, folklore that John has passed on to me, I know immediately when I walk into a space what that decoration is, the condition, the state of what it stands, and what's required to repair it. So it puts me in a very unique position in our industry from a business and craft point of view. But I think it all starts with the mentorship and traditional apprenticeship that John gave me, fortunately.
John, I had asked David how he got into this line of work. And so when you were in Scotland, tell us about the work you were doing before you arrived in Connecticut.
Oh, okay. So I served a 5-year apprenticeship as a painter and decorator, specializing in church decoration. So this was some 60 years ago, 60 odd years ago. And there was an apprenticeship program that existed in the United Kingdom there for apprentices, whereby during this 5-year apprenticeship, an apprentice the term was a day release. We were released 1 or 2 days a week to attend college without an interruption in our pay. But that had a condition to it. And that condition was that one apprentice would attend night school, probably 3 to 4 nights a week. So during that system, I was able to attend the Scottish DTI, that's the Scottish Decorative Trades Institute, the Stowe College of Building, and of course, night classes at the Glasgow School of Art. So when I emigrated to the United States, I had this accumulated knowledge when I say accumulated knowledge, let me try and explain that. An apprentice, the nature of an apprenticeship is the handing down of skills from one journeyman to an apprentice, in other words, from generation to generation. So way back in the late 1950s, I was fortunate enough to work with tradesmen who were plying their trades since the turn of the century and were able to hand down this knowledge and techniques to me of that period. So that's how I came to this industry, and it's the only industry that I've worked in, enjoyed, and loved.
You're hearing John Canning again, founder and a principal at John Canning Company based in Cheshire. David Riccio is also here, a principal at this company, as we learn more about the work that they're doing in places like the Twain House. If you have a question or comment, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So getting back to the Mahogany Suite, John, that you're part of this team, you and others from your company, helping to restore the guest quarters in the Mark Twain House. You mentioned earlier the United Artists and Candace Wheeler. So talk about that, the work that you're doing to model their decorations.
Okay, well, as I say, the architectural research was conducted by the project architect David Scott Parker. There was quite a few blanks that had to be filled in. We do know that the ceiling and walls of the guest suite were wallpapered, but the wallpaper was lost. So I believe that it was agreed by everyone that a substitute wallpaper that possibly would have been used was used for the walls. And that, of course, was a Candace Wheeler's beehive wallpaper. We had that reproduced, well, let's say the architect had it reproduced by Bradbury and Bradbury, who were specialized in reproducing historic wallpapers. They reproduced this wallpaper on canvas rather than wallpaper because there was some evidence in the past that it was canvas that was used, not wallpaper. So they reproduced, Bradbury and Bradbury reproduced Candace Wheeler's wallpaper on canvas. I believe there are 6 different patterns on this wallpaper that had to be pieced together perfectly butt jointed. So as explained, that our role in the restoration was to implement the work using the original, the Victorian methods and materials that had been used in that period. And there was a number of techniques that were somewhat lost at the present day that we had to employ into achieving these perfectly butted edges. Butted edges mean 2 edges coming together, being butted together.
And David, can you add to that? So distinguishing the decoration from the conservation and restoration work.
Sure. The restoration in this case is a replication of what was once there. And the conservation in this case would be the stabilization of the plaster and the woodwork. For example, the woodwork was, as noted, mahogany. The original woodwork was aniline dye stained, which is a type of stain, if you will, that is not often used today, but it's really truly a dye. And the wood is dyed to a particular color, in this case, a warm brown color. And then traditional shellac is applied and then waxed. Again, these kind of materials and techniques aren't often used in commercial projects today. With the DIY availability of products off the shelf, homeowners and contractors just grab out what's most convenient and easiest to use. But we tend to and want to use those traditional methods and techniques. So when it comes to that varnishing using the shellac, we mix our own shellac. We take the shellac flake, we melt it down with denatured alcohol and get it to a certain consistency, a recipe, if you will, and then apply it by hand. And it's a little bit more laborious because there are multiple applications that are required and preparatory steps in between each application where we're sanding and cleaning off the surface and then reapplying till we get a nice buildup of a mirror type finish, if you will. And then it's ultimately waxed. And when we wax the surface, we apply the wax to protect the finish, but also to control and to enhance the reflection and sheen. So those are some of the things that were done with the wood. And then with the plaster, we conserved the plaster where we stabilized it. Some of the old-fashioned 3-coat plaster, and often people talk about horsehair plaster, which was the case here. I'm not exactly sure if it was horsehair, if it was some other animal, such as goat, but that old-fashioned plaster was coming away, and we stabilized it using fasteners and glues and adhesives and things like that.
We've been talking about the Twain House, which I believe, again, your work as part of a team won a 2020 Preservation Connecticut Award for the restoration of the mahogany suite. But David, talk through with us about some of the other landmarks that the John Canning Company has been able to work on, not just in Connecticut, but around the globe.
Well, we've been fortunate over the past 45 years to work in some of America's architectural treasures. I'd say first and foremost, we've started with the U.S. Capitol, and over the past 40 years, we've been there on various occasions, restoring and conserving some of the most precious artwork in the building, including some of the work in the Bermuda corridors. We've worked at the the White House, many state capitol buildings, and as a result of the January 6th attack, we are once again back at the U.S. Capitol doing conservation work of the Bermuda corridors. Unfortunately, we're there for the wrong reasons, but I'm glad we're there nonetheless. We've also obviously we've worked at the Grand Central Terminal in New York City, where we conserved the concourse ceiling there, the sky mural, as most tourists know it, and many theaters and in sacred spaces of all denominations.
David, that must be quite meaningful for you and your team when you mentioned the work that you're doing at the U.S. Capitol after January 6th. This is the people's house. Such disrespect shown for that place and the people in it that day. What does it mean to you to be part of this project?
It's humbling, to say the least. We're grateful to be considered and to be a part of that. It is upsetting, of course, but and that's what I thought on January 6th, that while we've done a lot of work here, those craftsmen that John talked about, these incredible craftsmen, architects that preceded us, in the servants in the building, past and present, and the jobs they were doing, it was just sad to see that. But being a part of that is humbling, and every time we walk into the U.S. Capitol building or other buildings that I've mentioned, they are civic cathedrals, and they are the best of us architecturally and artistically speaking, as well as craft. So we are honored to be part of these types of endeavors. And we know that what we're doing is preserving the past. It's really stabilizing, presenting the past to us today, in which we can learn from that. And then obviously the work that we're doing today is going to bring us forward.
I mentioned again that you've done work around the globe. John Canning, just briefly, you've got an interesting anecdote about some work in Hawaii. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, in the company here, we like to, when we're describing the work we're doing, we like to describe that we've worked in mansions from Hartford to Hawaii. And of course, in Hawaii, we restored part of Doris Duke's Shangri-La home, just at the bottom of the Diamond volcano. That was for us one of the first real dealing with Islamic art, because the entire house is based upon palaces that Doris Duke acquired during our honeymoon from the Middle East and Iraq and Iran, and pieced together this beautiful house in Hawaii with all of this Islamic art. And again, that was my first exposure to real Islamic art, and so that is our experience in Hawaii.
Lucy, for those that don't know, Doris Duke, her family founded Duke University, and a very wealthy family in America. She had homes in Newport and other places throughout the country.
You're hearing David Riccio here on Where We Live, a principal at John Canning Company. Also, John Canning, founder and principal at John Canning Company. Again, it's a historic building restoration and conservation company based in Cheshire. We've been focusing on buildings, but there's a really interesting project that this company is involved in to restore so-called ghost signs. We'll talk more about that right after a short break. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Have you heard of so-called ghost signs? You've no doubt walked or driven by them. Faded business advertisements painted onto old buildings. There are efforts in some Connecticut towns to preserve these ghost signs. Some date back to the late 1800s. My guests today are involved in helping to restore ghost signs in Old Saybrook. Yeah. John Canning and David Riccio here on Zoom. So, David, let's talk through with us about these ghost signs and how John Canning and Company got involved involved with the work in Old Saybrook.
Oh, very well. Yeah. We received a call in 2020 during the middle of the pandemic from the Historic Society there, asking us to look at a very important building in the town that had old-fashioned signs that were kind of ghosting through various layers of signs and periods of signs, and they kind of all have melded together into and washed away and eroded to the point where you can just faintly make out some of the letters and some of the words, or maybe the business itself. So we're called in to examine it, to try and figure out what was there, what can be saved, if anything. Can they salvage it? Can it be conserved, as the term we use in practice we perform? And so I went and brought a ladder up there, a 6-foot ladder, and some tools and some cleaning agents and solvents, and went to the sign, which is the building is 274 Main Street, and it's at a corner, and it has a pretty interesting history, which is important to the signs, I think. The building was built somewhere in around 1850. We don't have an exact date, but we know from town maps, the first map showing the building was 1853. So we know that much. And at the time, the building was constructed by a gentleman by the name of Amos Sheffield, and he used it and was intended as a grocery store with some private residence quarters or rental space above. And so Sheffield and Son had their business there for some years. And at some point, the Stokes brothers took over the grocery store. And this is really important to the building and to the greater history of the town. Stokes brothers had the business for some 30 plus years, going into the 1920s, I believe. I don't have this history exact, but it appears from all records they were there into the 1920s anyways. And Stokes brothers and their business grocery store was much more than that, as you can imagine during this period. The grocery store served obviously for groceries, but it offered hardware, dry goods, clothing. It was like a department store, albeit a very small and specific scale. And the Stokes brothers were, I think, pretty advanced businessmen in how they viewed their customer and how they viewed their role in town. And that would be a movement I'd like to see in my town, frankly. But the Stokes brothers, a customer could come in and get their groceries and so forth, but they could also get their mail, believe it or not. So this was a social hub in town, this particular store. So customers coming around, socializing. I would say this location was the Facebook landing page of their day.
David, describe for us when we talk about what the painted advertisement at one time, what it must have looked like, and how you and your team are thinking about the chemistry in restoring something on this side of a building.
Yeah, so we know that the building at the north elevation, which is brick, red brick, and the Stokes brothers painted their first sign. We don't have a date, but they took up about 2/3 of the wall space. And so the sign is quite large. The original sign was about 25 feet long and about 10 feet tall. And they painted this sign with painters that were specialized in sign painting, which I would love John to at some point talk about old-fashioned sign painters, because that was a craft within the paint field that he practiced in that we don't no longer see anymore. But the paints that were used originally, they were oil paints, linseed oil paint at the time. The lettering were serif type letters, large in scale, very direct, trying to catch attention as signs, billboards do today still. So some 100 plus years, 130, 140 years later, we're still trying to catch the passerby's attention with large, sometimes garish signage. But the paints there were oil paints, and And they were painted over again and again, which I can talk about it later if you'd like me to get into.
We just have a couple of minutes, so I do want to hear from John about this lost art when we look at these painted billboards from the late 1800s. And, describe that for us, John, something we don't see today with our modern vinyl lettering.
Yeah, that is correct. The trade, if you will, is almost obsolete, although we still do hand-lettered, not so much signs, but in our decoration, in particular in churches where part of the decoration is the written word. So we still try to practice that sign writing trade, but again, it's almost obsolete. As a matter of fact, one of our employees who's now retired was a billboard painter and artist. And he had done some wonderful, not only signs, but artwork. And when, of course, the industry became obsolete, he joined our studio. To say he's now retired, but he was a real asset to us. Again, there's all sorts of techniques into sign writing. Of course, it has to do with knowledge of the style of lettering, size and spacing between the negative space between each letter. It's a very skillful trade, and I'm at the stage in life where I regret seeing all these vinyl signs.
Well, it sounds like a really interesting project down in Old Saybrook. David, do you know if other towns or cities in Connecticut, their historic preservation groups, are interested in restoring these ghost signs elsewhere?
I think this is unique. We have not received too many calls prior to this or after since we've done this work, even though this project has been put in the media and articles about it and so forth. So we haven't seen much of that, unfortunately. We do, when I drive and through Hartford and up 84 and down 91 and so forth, I see these ghost signs scattered throughout the towns and cities. And so much can be done with them because they do obviously depict a period of time that's really important and that we can learn from. And even the history of this building with the signs, because at various times in the history of this building, the signs changed, the ownership changed, the use of the building changed, and you could see that pictorial history through the ghost signs. So sometime after the Stokes brothers moved out, a Colonial package store came in, and then Crowley Real Estate came in, and they all had signs. And looking at the historic photographs, what we can see from the historic photographs from the 1940s and 50s, we see the outside of the building. And in every one of these images that we've used as a reference for our research, they depict some sort of patriotic celebration.
And David, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, talking about your craft, your passion. David Riccio, a principal at John Canning & Company, also John Canning himself, founder of this company based in Cheshire. We'll send out some pictures on our social and on our web post of some of these really interesting archival photos. Today's show produced by Katie Pellico. Thanks to Gina Amatruda on the boards. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel.